So thank you for being with us, Mr. Consul.
Glad to be
Um,
here.
Thank you. We wanted to talk about how you entered the Foreign Service in the United States. I did a little research. You've been in it a couple since about 2004, right?
That's right. Came in May of 2004.
So tell us a little bit about where you grew up. What did you study in school, and what made you switch to I want to be a diplomat?
Yeah. Well, actually, I've got a little bit of a less traditional path to the Foreign Service. I'm a farm boy. I grew up on a dairy farm in southwestern Virginia in the Shenandoah Valley, Rockbridge County, Virginia. And I studied French starting in 8th grade in middle school, Brownsburg Middle School in Brownsburg, Virginia, and continued that through high school and liked it. We had exchange students when I was in high school, one who lived with us my whole 10th grade year and the other one who lived with us for my entire 12th grade year. And that sparked my interest in the language. And I went to college. I went to Roanoke College in Salem, Virginia, and double majored actually in French and history. And so I came out with a BA in both, in history and French, and was able to do an exchange during that time with James Madison University to Martinique in the French West Indies, semester at the Université des Antilles, so the Antilles University there. And then just continued from there. I went to grad school at Virginia Tech, got an MBA. And as part of my MBA, I did a semester abroad in Paris, actually at a telecom school, it's now called Télécom Sud Paris. Which was fascinating, taking management classes with engineering students, completely taught in French. So that helped, I think, improve my French language abilities quite a bit. So.
Sure, and it seems that that is the case. Usually, what I notice with my colleagues who study French at LSU is the ones who really break through. Not saying it's impossible otherwise, but the ones that really break through are the ones who do those sort of immersion trips for long periods of time in francophone places.
Absolutely. Yeah. So to join the Foreign Service, I joined as a generalist, which means I'm an officer and I can serve across our 5 cones. I can explain a bit about that if you'd like, but I took the Foreign Service exam in 2003. It was a written exam. It's changed a bit over time, but took the written exam and passed it, and then was invited to the oral assessment, which is basically a day-long interview in Washington, D.C., and was fortunate enough to pass that and receive an offer. And it took about a little over a year from the time of the test and interview to actually beginning with what we call A100. It's the orientation class for new U.S. diplomats, new Foreign Service officers. So there's a process where you have to get a top secret security clearance and a medical clearance and things like that. So I started in May of 2004.
Now, is it and I'm not quite sure to be honest with you, but is it a very, very, very difficult selective process and actually, getting through and getting selected to be a diplomat? Is it very hard?
I think it still is. I think the test has changed over time. I haven't taken it. I don't know if I would pass it now, honestly. It is a fairly comprehensive test that tests you on all sorts of different things like knowledge of U.S. history, U.S. culture, U.S. government. And then the oral exam it's a day-long event, and it's fairly extensive. You're answering a lot of questions about situations that you may be in as a Foreign Service officer overseas. There's a group activity. I think when I took the written exam, the year I took it, I think there was something on the order of 30,000 people who took it, and I want to say 500 or 600 passed. And then the day I took the interview, there were 12 of us, and I believe 2 of us got offers out of that. So it was fairly selective, yes.
Definitely, it sounds like it. And once you got the call, I guess, or the news, what were your emotions like? Did you have any expectations? I guess you probably assumed, wow, this is a great job, but they might send me anywhere in the world.
That's the expectation. When you join the U.S. Foreign Service, you agree to be worldwide available. So you're theoretically able to be assigned to any post in the world. And so I came in, I was, single, no kids, and I was up for anything. And so my preference was to go somewhere French speaking because I had the French language. And so my first posting was to the U.S. Embassy in Libreville, Gabon, in West Africa. And so I went out there for 2 years, which was also fantastic for my French language skills because my employees, by and large, didn't speak English. And most of my meetings happened in French. I had an assistant who was a French guy who was living there in Gabon, and his English wasn't very good. And so we did all of our communications in French, which was just fantastic.
Great. Lucky you had the skills to, another example right there of how, your French education in school paid off right away, right off the bat, right?
Did, yeah, I was happy to be able to use it.
And then I saw also you, after your post there, you moved to some other countries, not particularly French-speaking ones.
No, and that's pretty typical, I think, in a foreign service career. You don't necessarily get assigned to countries that you have any background or expertise in. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. We have a bidding process whereby we bid on jobs about a year in advance. And we also have a requirement to perform a consular tour. And so my second tour was actually in Tegucigalpa, Honduras. I wanted to do consular work. I wanted to try to do it in a smaller country and in a Spanish-speaking country. So I was able to learn Spanish. The State Department will train you in the language that your country uses. And so I spent 6 months in Spanish training, did an immersion program in Buenos Aires, Argentina, which was fantastic. And then did 2 years as a consular officer in Honduras, which was very interesting work, very rewarding, very busy. And then from there, I actually came back to DC. I was in Washington for 5 years. And then after that, I was in Armenia for 2 years as management officer at the embassy, basically in charge of everything that keeps the embassy running, from logistics to facilities management to human resources. And then from there, did 3 years in Copenhagen, Denmark, in the same job, management officer. And then in 2019, moved down here to Bordeaux. And I've been here for almost exactly 1 year now as consul.
Two things I want to talk. I want to hear about the DC stint, but I wanted to ask. You just talked about they have a bidding process. So could you kind of briefly explain how that works? I'm assuming the more tourist cities such as Paris, Dublin are probably the ones people want to scoop up quicker.
Correct. Yeah. So we've got a couple of different bidding cycles. There's a summer cycle and a winter cycle. The summer cycle tends to have more jobs on it simply because that's when most people rotate, especially people with kids like I do. They want to get to post before school starts. And so about a year in advance of your rotation date from post, most of our posts are either 2 years or 3 years long, our assignments overseas. About a year before your rotation date, you'll receive the bid list, which comes out generally sort of late summer. And you take a look at your list, and for officers beyond their second tour, you're really in charge of your own bidding. Is to say that you take charge and contact the posts you would like to serve at. You contact the bureaus in Washington, D.C. who control assignments to those posts. And you're right, posts like London or Rome or Paris tend to be heavily bid, typically heavily bid, whereas more difficult places like Libreville may be less bid. Although, to be honest with you, my experience in some of those posts was extremely rewarding. Yerevan, Armenia, for example, it's a post that's pretty far away from the U.S. That most people probably don't know much about, but it was a fantastic place to live and very rewarding work. So a lot of times you can have these hidden gems, postings that you can be fortunate to work in a country with a lot of important things going on and some great people you work with. So
Interesting, interesting. And when you decided to come back to DC, um, sort of what was that your decision or was that?
yeah, it was. So I was coming back, coming out of my second tour in Honduras, and when you're a junior officer or an entry level officer, coming out of your second tour, you're entering a new world of advocating for yourself in the bidding process, and it's fairly common for folks to come back in their third or fourth tour to Washington, just to get some experience with that side of things. There's the overseas postings, and then there's as you probably know, a large bureaucracy in Washington at what we call Main State at the department, who manages all these overseas posts. And so I came back my third tour and actually went on to the INR Watch, the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the State Department. And so that's a 24-hour watch that's staffed all the time, shifts going overnight and early morning, and you're constantly shifting from those late night shifts to day shifts. So it was a very interesting job, somewhat tiring because your sleep schedule is a bit strange. But
Where is this at like what building?
This is actually in Main State in Washington D.C.
Is it like in one of the more notable, like the Pentagon or something like that?
It's actually in the Harry S. Truman building at the State Department's main headquarters there on C Street in D.C. So right downtown D.C. And the great thing about that tour was they give you a parking pass, so you get to park underneath the department, and you're there at all sorts of different hours of the day and night. So
right.
Really rewarding work. And then from there, I actually received an invitation to go work at the White House. This was back in 2010. They tend to second several State Department officers to the White House Situation Room. So I was a duty officer at the White House after my year at INR. Another shift work job. The shifts there were a little bit different. They ran from 5 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon. And then on your second half of shifts, you're working 5 p.m. to 5 a.m. So long shifts, fascinating work. We connected a lot of calls between the White House staff, including the president and the vice president, to their foreign counterparts. So yeah, it was definitely a mile a minute job, but extremely rewarding.
Yes, so we got to talk about that a little bit. So is working in the White House as incredible as it sounds? I mean, I'm sure anybody on earth would think that's extraordinary.
It was. I think a lot of it is you can be there on an overnight shift where you're mainly producing written products for the White House staff, such as the National Security Advisor, the Deputy National Security Advisor. You may handle some incoming calls. That tended to be sometimes a little bit quieter. Day shifts could be very busy. You could have unexpected calls pop up, requests for calls to foreign leaders. Sometimes they needed to be secure calls. So we worked a lot with our Air Force colleagues who handle the communications there. It was a really rewarding tour, absolutely. 1 year was, most people there are there for a couple years, but the State Department people tend to do 1 year because our system works a little bit differently. And we tend to have a little bit shorter careers. A lot of times we can retire at age 50 with at least 20 years of service in the State Department. So
nice. So let me ask you this. Now, how often are you seeing, the President of the United States working in the White House? Like, does it become a common sight? Is it still, wow, it's the President, or a little bit of both?
We would see him, fairly regularly. It would depend on the shift. More often than not, it was by phone. We were connecting phone calls between the President and other foreign heads of state. But occasionally, we were in the Situation Room, which is just adjacent to the meeting rooms in the West Wing. And so it was fairly common to see, everybody, including the president, there in that space.
That's very, very interesting. I watched a documentary about, well, it was a short video about one of the workers in the White House. She actually was I believe it may have been Ronald Reagan's, I believe it was Ronald Reagan's sort of secretary. And she said, basically you're working and living history, your workplace is, I mean, just every day you're making history, and all the great, men and women that have been there before. It's really, really sort of eye-opening and breathtaking experience, from.
It really was. It was one of those jobs where you never knew exactly what was going to happen on a given shift. You could have a very quiet shift, or dictated by world events. You could have a very busy shift and a lot of calls and a lot of products going out. So yeah, it definitely kept us on our toes.
Right. Yeah. So that's the same room, correct? When, like, for example, like the recent explosion in Lebanon, or like a massive, tsunami, that's the sort of like the disaster management room for the federal government.
Right. That's the sort of the nerve center of the White House. So any sort of breaking news, any sort of event around the world, like you bring up a good example, the recent explosion in Beirut, Lebanon. That would be an event where most likely the Situation Room would be in touch with either folks from the State Department in Beirut, or something along those lines, to update the White House leadership on what's going on. So
interesting. Very, very cool. Very interesting. So we'll talk about after you left your 1-year shift at the White House. You then moved to the Bureau of Overseas Buildings Operations.
Correct. Yeah, I came back to the State Department, and that brought me back to my cone. We have management. We have career tracks. There are 5 tracks in the State Department for generalists, Foreign Service officer generalists. I'm in the management track, so I'm a management officer. The other tracks are consular, political, econ, and public diplomacy. And so I came back to the management cone, so to speak. I worked as an area management officer, which essentially is the Foreign Service liaison to the Bureau of Overseas Buildings Operations. And those are the folks who handle construction projects to build new U.S. embassies and consulates facilities overseas, and also handle the maintenance of the U.S. Facilities overseas. And that's a very big job. There are a lot of rehabilitation projects, a lot of just standard maintenance that goes on. And so we each had a portfolio of posts. I covered a variety of posts during my 3 years there, everything from the very small U.S. consulate in Hamilton, Bermuda, all the way out to, I had Russia, so I had everything out to Vladivostok in eastern Russia, so quite a good reach there. And we typically visited our posts once a year or once every couple of years, just to get a feel for what the issues were as far as the actual physical facility and what sort of projects we would be funding.
So during, your stint domestically, I don't know if this is an obvious question, but are you still a diplomat at this time?
That's right. Yeah, so you're not accredited to another country. You're based domestically, but I would travel overseas. I use the diplomatic passport. I would go what we call TDY, which is temporary duty. You're traveling on official U.S. government travel orders. And a typical trip for me, I would go to 3 different posts in 3 different countries. So, for example, I would go to Belarus, I would go to Kiev, Ukraine, and then I would maybe go to Bucharest, Romania, and then come back. So a lot of travel. That job involved about 25% travel. So used a lot of airline points during that time, but it was very worthwhile to work. You're in that job, you work with a lot of civil servants and a lot of contractors, architects, engineers, budget folks, everything that goes into large building projects, construction projects. maintenance projects. I'm not an engineer, but I certainly learned a lot working with those guys, and it was really worthwhile.
That's an interesting little kind of a niche thing I talked about to the French Consul General in New Orleans. Sort of how different is it traveling as a diplomat with a diplomatic passport rather than an ordinary passport? And he actually told me he was somewhere with his diplomatic passport, and I guess they don't. Sometimes smaller airports don't get a lot of diplomats, and they told him at the airport, "We don't do diplomats here at this airport." Obviously, they were mistaken, but I mean, is there a little more stipulations and going through with that kind of stuff?
No, I mean it really depends on the airport and the country. Some countries I've traveled to have diplomatic lines, and those tend to be for foreign diplomats entering that country, and so occasionally they would expedite my passage through. Sometimes not. It really depended on the country. We have diplomatic lines in the United States, but when I return to the States, I just use the regular line. I come through like any other U.S. citizen returning to the country.
Interesting. We talked too about to Consul General in New Orleans how he told me that there is a such thing as sort of a diplomatic purse or a pouch. And he says, when he travels with maybe like a citizen's passport or something, there's sort of an impenetrable sort of bag that, is sort of kind of cool, unique to diplomats that you can maybe,
Yeah, no. When I travel with personal luggage and things like that. We do have a diplomatic pouch, which is handled by we have a bureau for that, diplomatic pouch and mail, and we have diplomatic couriers who actually escort pouches overseas on flights. I personally don't do that. They handle that aspect of the business, but that is correct. The diplomatic mail is subject to inviolability and comes in. We're actually very happy to have it here because we receive mail from the States either through the diplomatic pouch or through what we call DPO, the diplomatic post office, which is similar to APO for the military.
wow.
And so we receive our mail that comes through a facility sorted either in Chicago or just outside DC. So
Very, very cool. Very cool. Okay, so now we want to talk about your current role, Bordeaux. I've been to France a couple of times. I never had the privilege to go to Bordeaux. So we want to ask you, firstly, who picked you for this role, and how was your experience like when you got the news? And after that, we'll talk about how Bordeaux is visually for maybe those who haven't been.
sure thing. Yeah. So the way I came to this job in Bordeaux was similar to the other jobs that other assignments I had in the Foreign Service. I bid on this job. I was bidding on a number of posts, jobs all the way from, there was a job in Bogota, Colombia, another in Hungary, another in Toronto, Canada, another one in Australia. And so I put together my bid list, interviewed for jobs, and, was fortunate enough to get an offer to come here to Bordeaux, which is, frankly, it was sort of a dream post. It's a very small post. It's very different from the other assignments I've had overseas. Coming from, just give you the example of the U.S. Embassy in Copenhagen, where you've got, a couple hundred people working and a large staff, both of local employees, Danes, and also Americans assigned to the post. Come down here to Bordeaux, there's only me. I'm the only American assigned here with 2 local employees. So that was a big change, which frankly I love it. It's a challenge. We cover the entire Nouvelle-Aquitaine region of southwestern France, which is a fairly new designation within France. It's a large piece of territory all the way from Poitiers and Limoges to the north of here, down south to the Spanish border. And that's an area larger than the size of Austria, just to give you an example. And so it's quite a bit of territory to cover with just the 3 of us. Haven't gotten to visit every place in Nouvelle Aquitaine yet, but I hope to within my 3 years here. Bordeaux it's a beautiful place, as you might imagine. It's an old port city, had a lot of commerce dating back centuries. The United States established a post here. Actually, it was one of our first diplomatic posts in 1778, which was a commercial agent, somebody dealing with the commerce coming out of the port. And then the first U.S. Consul was actually assigned here in 1790. His name was Joseph Fenwick, and to this day, there's still the building that he lived in and worked out of. It's called the Hotel Fenwick. It's right there where it always was since I believe it was finished in the late 1790s. We're no longer located in that building. We're just down the street, but it's great to see that legacy continues here in Bordeaux.
Definitely. I love how they preserve history. And yeah, I read a little bit about that, how they said, yes, it was one of the first ever consul. It's very, very old. So that's really cool. It shows how old our friendship is between, our nation of America and France. But Bordeaux does look, from Google Images as it's a very, very beautiful place. It looks like it's got some of that Parisian style French architecture.
Its architecture reminds me a bit, honestly, of New Orleans, and then that has to do a lot with the history. There were traditionally, historically, a lot of links between this part of France and New Orleans. You'll see a lot of the typical balconies, the buildings with the curved balconies around the side. Like if you walk down the French Quarter in New Orleans, you would think you're walking down some of the side streets of Bordeaux. The climate here tends to be very hot and dry. It's hot and humid now, but the architecture here, I think, reflects a bit of that. Bordeaux is called the Blonde City, and that is a result of the buildings being made of sandstone and limestone, so very white buildings. And the city government here did a great job a few years ago. They washed all the buildings, which had become blackened with soot from the traffic, the vehicle traffic coming through the city. They actually scraped off all of that soot, and it made the buildings really vibrant. So it's a really beautiful place. The city was very industrial for many, many decades, and the city did a great job of reviving the downtown area. On the banks of the Garon River, they turned that area from an industrial warehouse zone into a pedestrian-friendly area that attracts tourists from all over. They have a brand new wine museum here called the Cité du Vin, which features fantastic exhibits on wine from this region and from all over the world. Right now, unfortunately, we're not seeing very many Americans here at all with the current travel restrictions with COVID, but typically you would see Americans, including cruise ships. The tourists this year are limited mostly to folks from Spain and Germany, other parts of Europe. And then the region, of course, is one that attracts typically a lot of tourists, including Americans. You've got the wine country, world famous in this region, and also the Dordogne region out to the east of here, with lots of medieval castles and paleological sites. And then all the way down, of course, to the Basque country, which straddles the border between Spain and France.
Definitely seems like a very, very interesting area. And I hope I could personally see it one day. And like you said, it is a shame, and it is sad that the virus is as described. It's the gift that keeps on getting worse, and
Right.
I'm sorry.
We've had to change up our program a bit with COVID since March, just like everybody else. A lot of the things we had planned didn't happen. They got canceled due to COVID. Probably the most prominent was the 4th of July celebration, which we actually were going to do in the old Fenwick house overlooking the Garonne River in our old original consulate. That couldn't happen. That was the case with most large events here since March. The rates of COVID have decreased in France, though there are some increasing pockets lately with lots of crowds of tourists in the summer. So we'll hope for the best going forward in the fall. We've done a lot of increasing virtual programming, which we'll continue to do with the idea and the hope for getting back to some in-person programming later on.
Right. And I've even noticed, myself as just a private visitor, the differences in, diplomacy for us. I was in the process of, or I am in the process of getting a long stay visa as a volunteer. And now the French embassy, where you normally would have many, many, many different types of, long stay visas, is now only doing like the most essential, as in I have a relative in France that needs, medical care, or my spouse is trapped there, and they're not doing sort of non-required, like I don't need to go. So it's hard for me to go. I can't go. And I even got an email just today. I called the embassy in Paris, and they're doing virtual interviews for passport renewals. I saw. It was like a pilot location, so they're gonna allow you to renew your passport there, and maybe get a second passport. I saw that's a thing they're doing now too. They're doing a second passport if you travel a lot, I guess.
Yeah, that's been one thing that's been, all travel has been very disrupted, obviously, since March. But we shifted to more to our consular role. We have a limited consular role here in Bordeaux. Up until 2014, we actually issued passports and did notarials and things like that. But since then, all of that work has been shifted to the U.S. Embassy in Paris. But we did answer a lot of questions. We had a lot of Americans with travel questions. There are 5,000 or 6,000 Americans living here in this district, and a lot of dual citizens. So we fielded a lot of questions also from French people asking about travel to the United States, everything from tourists to students and family members. And so I think that's actually that side of our work has increased quite a bit since March, whereas our other things like public outreach have decreased.
Right. And yeah, I did want to ask about the roles of the consulate. I talked to Consul General Hankinson in Marseille, and he said that's the second biggest city in France, and they don't even do passports. But what he described it as is if someone is in dire need of one, as in like a very, very, huge emergency, then they can, I guess, wake him up and get it rolling, So is that something y'all do, like emergency stuff like that?
We no longer do even emergency documents. We do occasionally do emergency American citizen services. Like, for example, if we have a U.S. citizen who is arrested and imprisoned here, we can be called upon to do a prison visit to make sure that person is taken care of in the correct way, and to give them information on attorneys and things like that. But we don't issue passports, either regular passports or emergency passports here. We do typically host American Citizen Services Days, typically twice a year. Unfortunately, it looks like this year in 2020, both of our days are going to be canceled. The one in April didn't happen, and it's looking like the one in the fall won't happen either, where we actually bring consular officers down from Paris and host consular services in our office here in Bordeaux. So we would like to resume that, obviously, when we can, hoping for early 2021 if that's possible. I think that's helpful for folks who are Americans who actually live here in our district.
Sounds incredibly helpful. So I'm assuming, sort of, yes. Elaborate if you can a little bit more about, the roles of the consul. It's obviously a small consulate. So is it more, would you say, like cultural initiatives and language initiatives rather than, like you said, consular work?
It really is. A very large chunk of our work here at the consulate is on the public diplomacy side and the cultural side. So we go out and do all sorts. Typically, when we don't have COVID restrictions, we do lots of programs, everything from educational programs. We bring in writers and poets from the United States to do programs in middle schools and high schools, for example. We had a celebrity chef here earlier this year, Tiffany Derry out of Texas, who came and did cooking programs in what they call lycée pro, which is basically the equivalent of a vocational high school. And we did those outside of Bordeaux. I do presentations on American politics. Obviously, this year, the elections are a big topic. We talk about the Electoral College, which is very different from the system here in France. And so we go out and visit the universities here in Bordeaux. There are several universities. Bordeaux has over 100,000 university students. So there's tremendous appetite, I think, for our sorts of cultural programming. Since March, we've moved a lot to virtual programming. A lot of that's run through the U.S. Embassy in Paris. Like, for example, we had a U.S. astronaut with NASA do a live session through which we amplified through our Facebook page, which was very successful. It's fascinating to hear from her and her time on the space station. And so we look forward to getting back to some more in-person programming. We had a lot of people lined up to come. We had a musical group from New York. We have folks who are experts on U.S. government and elections, things like that. But we're sort of on hold to see whether we can do anything in person or whether we'll have to continue virtually.
Right. That's definitely interesting initiatives to hear. And I was going to ask, how does that work? Like, for example, if you have we have an election coming up. Americans right now that are inside of France, is it possible to vote while abroad?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and then that runs through the embassy in Paris. So they run voting assistance programs for voting by mail, absentee ballot voting. And so, for example, just for me, I'll typically get an absentee ballot from my home district, which is Arlington County, Virginia, and I mail it in through the diplomatic mail. And the embassy also can assist American citizens here with that process.
Interesting. I was going to ask, speaking of the embassy and sort of, like you said, famous politicians, do you guys get a lot of celebrities other than the ones we just mentioned? I would assume probably most, high-level State Department people go to Paris.
Typically, yes. Yeah, we actually did. Just after I arrived here last August, we had the G7 summit, which was in Biarritz, which is about an hour and a half south of here. Huge, series of meetings, and the meetings themselves lasted for a few days. But the run up to that was a lot of preparation, dealing with the airport here, for example, here in Bordeaux, where Air Force One landed, and the advanced crew. There were a lot of elements, including security, and so it was great to work with the French colleagues here on all sides, the diplomatic side, the security side. I got here at the very tail end of it, so I only saw, the week leading up to the meetings. And I was not in Biarritz, I was here in Bordeaux. But we did have a lot of folks down from the embassy in Paris to help out with those meetings. And at the end of the day, it went pretty well. This was a little bit disruptive for the folks living in Biarritz because there was lots of zones of security, but that's typically the way those events are conducted.
I didn't even realize that, because we were watching that in my international, not watching it, but we were monitoring it in my international politics class at LSU, and it was just amazing to see, politics aside, just the modern leaders of the world that we study, all together, doing, I guess, the grand level of diplomacy, right? I mean, I guess you could say the president's the highest diplomat, right?
Right. That was an opportunity for President Trump to speak directly with President Macron. And that's probably a spotlight that doesn't typically get shown on a very small place like Biarritz, which is down by the Spanish border. That was probably the biggest event that they had hosted in a decade or more. So logistically, I think it was challenging, but it came off very well, I thought, and everything went smoothly. And so we were happy to have being able to contribute a small bit to that success.
Is that your area of responsibility diplomatically?
Yes, it does. Biarritz falls within our region, so it's within the Nouvelle-Aquitaine region, which goes all the way down to the border with Spain, and then over into the Basque Country by Pau and Orthez and that area.
Awesome. Have you ever had the opportunity to meet the president of France or anybody in the Élysée Palace?
I haven't met President Macron. No, I haven't. Just mostly the local officials here, the mayor of Bordeaux, which actually we've just had a mayoral election, and the previous mayor did not win the election, so we have a new mayor here in Bordeaux who I've not yet met, but I'll hope to do that soon. And then more sort of the local officials like the prefect and the folks who govern the Garon department and the Nouvelle-Aquitaine region.
Awesome. Okay, let's talk about language. I would assume, your post in Gabon was sort of a precursor to, adjusting to living in a French business setting every day, speaking French every day. So that definitely helped, I would assume.
It definitely did. So I was what we call the general services officer, which sounds somewhat generic, but it actually is the logistics officer for the embassy. So handling all of our housing, our leasing, motor pool operations, shipping and customs, everything that sort of keeps the embassy running day to day. So it was a great experience as far as French language, because I was dealing with directly with lots of local vendors, local stores, local maintenance staff, and a lot of those guys, most of those folks did not speak English. We had a few, occasionally there would be some, for example, some Nigerian folks that we would speak English, but for the most part, I would say 90% of the time it was in French.
Right. And how would you compare that to today in Bordeaux? I know, most every single human being in France speaks English, whether they want to or not. But how does that work now? How much do you use French in your job? And this right here can sort of be a visual to see for students studying French now, how it can be used in the real world.
I would say here, I'd say for the majority of my public appearances and speaking engagements, most of those are in French. I get invited to speak at a lot of different public events. Like, for example, on New Year's Eve, we had a commemoration for a U.S. bomber, a B-24, that was shot down in World War II, just north of here, about an hour north of here, and a bombing run. And every year, the town there does a commemoration for the pilots, a couple, and the crew, a couple of whom didn't survive the crash. And so I gave remarks in French. I often get invited to speak at schools. I spoke at a Model UN conference here back in the spring before the COVID hit. And so I would say the majority of those are in French. Some of them are in English. It depends on what our interlocutors ask. Some of those are bilingual schools or schools with an American section. And so they actually prefer to have us come and speak English so that their students can get a little bit of practice in English. I would say a lot of the students here, their English is quite good. In general, I would say English isn't really widely spoken in this part of France, more so in Paris, less so probably in this part of France. So as far as my opportunity to speak French, there's a lot more of that down here, I would say, than probably you would see in Paris. So I'm happy with that. Definitely the French language gets put to good use here.
It's definitely great to hear. And like I said, it is difficult for some people, that may not be familiar with diplomacy and international business and stuff to really kind of grasp in their mind, where am I ever going to use this at? I mean, if you studied French, I'm sure this type of people. So what kind of advice would you have to young students who kind of would need a boost in morale of why learning any foreign language is a great move to do?
Well, I think it's having foreign language skills it just gives you a leg up regardless of what you want to go into. I mean, if you want to go into business, the world is so globalized now. Businesses, you can be sent all over the world. There are lots of expats, American expats here working in all sorts of sectors. The one of the main economic sectors in this part of France is the aerospace industry. So you've got folks, Americans, a lot of times working with different companies like Ariane, Dassault. There's a company down in Po that makes helicopter engines. So you meet a lot of folks who really put those skills to use. I mean, if you've got French is a great language to know, Spanish, extremely useful. Um, you really open the world up to yourself. I mean, being in the foreign service, I think it really helps to have an aptitude for languages because you may use the language you came in with, but a lot of times you'll be assigned to posts where you don't know the language and you're going to have to be in training for anywhere from 24 weeks to 2 years. For example, if you learn Mandarin or Japanese, for example, you will go to training in Washington for a year and then out overseas for a year before you even start your posting. So I think it's always something that can be a great boost to your career prospects. Certainly something the State Department looks for when we are recruiting foreign service officers.
Interesting. And yeah, I watched a short video about, I guess they sort of accelerate, diplomatic candidates in foreign language. I don't know what building this was in, but they said there's like a building with a bunch of classrooms of each different language. And you can kind of see, it was really interesting. You're in DC, I guess, but you can see, you might look in the Arabic classroom and they're celebrating Ramadan, or you look and they're celebrating Chinese New Year one day. And is it like that over there? And I don't know what building this is, but
Sure. Yeah, that's what you were seeing there was the Foreign Service Institute, which is in Arlington, Virginia, and that's our training campus, and that includes all the language training. And you're right, it can be everything from more common languages like French or Spanish or Russian, all the way down to languages that are only spoken in one country, like Estonian or Danish. And my only experience personally there was doing 6 months of Spanish training, and yeah, it was great. You're in with native Spanish speakers, native speakers of that language, and you're getting an intensive course in the fundamentals of that language. And it's tough. There's a lot of hours put in, but it was extremely rewarding. You come out with at least a fairly decent knowledge of that language.
as a diplomat, and which is a career renowned for bilingualism, multilingualism, what have you found is the best way, if you had to tell a young college student learning a foreign language, what's the best way to learn it? How do diplomats learn them so quickly?
Well, I think we're fortunate to have the Foreign Service Institute, FSI, which has fantastic training. Honestly, just speaking from my personal experience, the Spanish training, you're in small classroom settings with native speakers. You're practicing one-on-one and in small groups. We have a language lab where you're practicing more virtually or with tapes. We also get an opportunity to do language immersion. So like I said, I did, I believe it was a 17-day trip down to Argentina where we just launched into it and spoke Spanish with taxi drivers and store clerks and anybody we could meet in the street in Buenos Aires, which is a bit tough because they have a little bit of a different accent there in Argentina in Spanish than you might see in other countries, but it was phenomenal. And so I think my advice would be, keep an open mind. I think a lot of language students probably already have that if they're interested in learning another language. Um, be patient. A lot of times it's going to be hard. You'll feel like you don't know anything when you're actually learning and retaining more than you may realize. I took a little bit of Russian when I was posted to Armenia. These were just classes that took place at the embassy, and some days it felt like I really was struggling, but then later on I would realize I would hear something spoken in Russian and realize I actually understood what that person said. So it's amazing what your mind is capable of retaining if you apply yourself to it.
That is, I guess, sort of the best feeling on earth is when you finally are seeing the light through the impossible, chapter you did in that day of French, or like you said, Russian. Okay, let's do two more little questions. The last question I'm going to ask you before I ask you about, concluding question is, we noticed, and my editor noticed, that you have some very impressive awards from the State Department. I wonder if you could briefly tell us the story behind those awards. You have two, right? Or is it?
Yeah, I won it was a group meritorious honor award. This was back in Honduras. That was more my work with the group of our consular officers. I like to say we had just about everything happen that can happen during a consular tour. We had a Category 5 hurricane. We had a major earthquake, about a 7.4 magnitude earthquake. We had a major airline disaster. We had a Taka, an Airbus 320, go off the end of the runway with some fatalities in that, in addition to all the normal consular work, visas and passports and all of that. And so, we had to pull together as a team and handle all those crises, which you never know what's going to crop up. You just have to pull together. And I thought we did a great job. We had a fantastic consul general there when I was there, and so that was a group team effort. And then I did receive a Superior Honor Award at my last post. That was in Copenhagen, Denmark, and that was for the work that and actually I need to give credit to my team here. I had a great team of great staff that helped us on a number of fronts. We had a fairly large rehabilitation project for the U.S. Embassy there in Copenhagen, which is an older building. It dates to the mid-50s, and so needs a lot of work. And so we did a lot of work behind the scenes to get that project started. And that was where a lot of that came from. We had some staff turnover. We were able to get our local staff a raise, which they hadn't had for quite some time. And so we hired some new folks, and it was a busy time, but I think it was definitely a rewarding experience.
Awesome. Great. We just want to ask the last question, which is, you've been in the Foreign Service for a large chunk of time, which is a great thing, and we wanted to know basically what you've learned. And you're fairly new to this post, which is great. What are your hopes for the future besides COVID? What are your target goals coming up?
Well, I think what I've learned is I probably used the motto that we had at the State Department's Operations Center, which was Semper Gumby, like always be flexible. You just never know what life may throw at you or what situations may arise overseas. My colleagues at the U.S. Embassy in Beirut absolutely are dealing with that right now with the explosion. We've got natural disasters, things that come up like COVID that were completely unforeseen. You need to remain flexible. I think that's probably my main lesson for being overseas is remain flexible and roll with it. A lot of times you're assigned to countries where the norm is definitely not what it is in the United States, which is fascinating, but at the same time can be a bit challenging, especially when you're like me, you have small kids, and so you're dealing with families. But I think that it's a great career for families with kids too, because my kids have gotten to experience all sorts of different countries and cultures. They've basically grown up overseas. They've lived in Armenia, Denmark, and now France. And so, yeah, that would be my takeaway. It's a fantastic career. It's a big adventure. And then going forward, well, really in the short term is hopefully we can get back to some more in-person projects. That, of course, is going to depend on what happens with COVID, whether we're going to be able to hold those or not. Right now with the travel restrictions, it's very complicated. But long term, I'd like to see us do a little more educational outreach. We've done some really rewarding programs with some schools that probably don't see Americans or American diplomats very often, vocational and technical schools, schools in underserved communities. And there are a lot of those opportunities around the Bordeaux area. Would like to get out to places in our region as well, like down to the south to Pau and Biarritz and Bayonne, up to the north to Poitiers and Limoges, which I haven't had a chance to visit yet. But we've got a lot of ideas and a lot of plans and projects which we hope to enact, my staff and I, over the next couple of years. But just keeping our fingers crossed as far as COVID.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for the interview.
And so, yeah, I really appreciate you, taking the time to speak with me today. I know it's morning your time, so it's an honor, and a privilege to get to speak with you. And I hope that this is useful to your viewers.
Thank you very much. It's an honor speaking with you, and I'm sure they'll love it. Like you said, like I said, we want to show these, and I'm young too, but I want to show people my age, the wonders in the world to learn French and try to push things out. I'm new to this journal, but my editor and stuff, he's been working hard, and we do like a writing contest. We had 1,100 entries all across America, and writing about why you learn French, or what's good about France, and so we're trying to get that back. As you know, Louisiana is a French place. We're trying to. There's something called Code of Phil. The Council for the Development of French. It was kind of stricken away from us. Like my grandpa, who lives right next to me, they spoke French when they were growing up. Right. They got beaten on the hand with rulers because they didn't know English. Yeah. So it took us a while as a state to realize we went in the opposite direction with culture. So
I think it's extremely worthwhile what you guys are doing to try to preserve that French language. That's a really valuable and unique part of American culture. That part of Louisiana where French is still spoken. I probably should have mentioned I did an event back in the fall with a town here in the Gers province of France. They did a twinning ceremony with the town of Breaux-Bridge, Louisiana, just outside Lafayette, and so. Oh, wow. I got to speak on Skype with the town council of Breaux-Bridge, and I was the American present at the ceremony here, and they had a Cajun band and Louisiana food, and it was fantastic. There's a lot of enthusiasm here in France for Louisiana culture, and they love it. So it's great that you guys are keeping this alive.
That is so crazy that you just said that, because my first interview that I did, which is, I believe it was on the 29th of last month, was the state representative for Breaux-Bridge. So we went to his office in Breaux-Bridge. Me and my colleague, Hannah, she's the director of social media, and we interviewed him. And, yeah, we were talking about the few dying places of French, left pockets of French. And the representative was talking about, he wants to get it back to 100%. So that's great that you saw that. That is a small town.
Absolutely. We'd love to get those guys from Breaux-Bridge over here to France, the town of Oz in Gers province. They were very excited about it and extremely enthusiastic. So hopefully one day we could see some of those folks over here from Louisiana.
Great. Thank you so much. And it was an honor. And if you ever come down to Louisiana, be sure you stop down at LSU.
I would love to. I came to a football game at LSU some years ago. I went to Virginia Tech, and we played LSU in football, and unfortunately the game didn't turn out very well. I think we lost about 48-7, but
Oh,
the
wow.
LSU Tigers fans were the most welcoming and wonderful I've ever met. It was hot as the blazes, but they were extremely welcoming with open arms, and we had a lot of jambalaya and gumbo and alligator and all that. So I really enjoyed it personally, and I hope to be able to come back down there again sometime. You guys are great.
We'd love to, and we very much appreciate, the word you say. And I believe you do have personally, I've noticed you have a very strong passion for French language, and I think you're a perfect person to broadcast, to our learners. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you as well, and best of luck to you guys in the future.
Thank you.